I'm Angie Coiro. This is In Deep. Mayday, Mayday. It was a day for Occupy to show its colors, its numbers, and its strengths. In some cities, it also showed its darker side with a trail of broken windows and shuttered businesses in its wake, and an alleged bomb plot in Cleveland. We're assessing the Mayday actions and the future of Occupy this hour on In Deep. We're going to look, before we dive into Occupy, at the other folks. If the Occupy is 99%, we do indeed have to look at the 1% as well. One thing you and I have been learning over the course of this show is that the rich are different from you and me. There's a worldview that apparently comes with the dollars. We're going to look at some of that as revealed through a number of articles that came out this week. Some of them compiled quite beautifully at the American Prospect by Jamelle Bouie. He's a writing fellow at the American Prospect and a fellow at the Nation Institute. He joins us for our Blogger Spotlight. Hi, Jamelle.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. I appreciate the way you put your finger on the difference of life perspective between the very moneyed, at least, you know, as we're coming to understand them, and the people who don't comprehend that level of money. And what you said was in response to the New York Times profile of a partner at Bain Capital, one of Romney's former colleagues. He expressed anger in his New York Times article over the praise Warren Buffett has received for pledging billions of his fortune to charity. He argued it was no sacrifice. Buffett still has plenty left over for his normal quality of life. By taking billions out of productive investment, Buffett was depriving the middle class of the potential for its 20-to-1 benefits. If anyone was sacrificing, it was those people. First, I commend you for selecting that paragraph to highlight because it tells us so much. But then you really say, for those of us who don't see wealth as the ultimate end, who see value in other non-monetary pursuits, who understand the power of chance and fortune, this is a horrifying worldview. Conard, the man who's being quoted, seems oblivious to the fact there are people who work hard in order to scrap by with the basics of life. It's not that these people are lazy. It's that they didn't win the cosmic dice game that put them in a position to reach the heights of American society. The cosmic dice game is something that, as I understand it, many of the people with the most money don't believe in. They will look at your column and say, these are the merits. I brought myself up by my own bootstraps. I built this myself. What would you say to them?
Right. I mean, I would say that they're delusional. I don't know what it is about becoming fabulously wealthy that does this to someone. But the simple fact is that, well, I'm sure that they did work hard and they did sacrifice a lot. Opportunity is one of those things that emerges under the right circumstances. And I guarantee that the vast majority of people on Wall Street who are making, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars per year are people who grew up in good families, who had good opportunities, who were given a certain work ethic, who were in the right place at the right time, sort of innumerable number of variables that all went in their favor to get them to that point. And so it's very odd to me that someone would say, would present themselves and their wealth as purely the effort of their own individual person, because there's nothing in anyone's life that is, or very few things in anyone's life that is purely the result of your individual effort.
One of the things that you're kind of poking a hole in right there is the accusations that are foisted upon us, by which I mean the left, saying that we're engaging in class war by pointing these things out. We are class warriors who are trying to encourage the divide in America.
Right. And that's something I find very odd. There is a massive disparity of wealth between the richest Americans and everyone else, and this is something that ought to be discussed. Pointing it out and saying that societies with huge inequality of wealth tend to be societies that are unequal in many other ways isn't class warfare. It's simply pointing out a fact and proposing we do something about it. But honestly, the proposed solutions to this, simply taxing rich people a little more, taking that money and spending it on social programs for everyone else, is, in my view, very minor. It's not radical. It's not the least bit radical. It's, in fact, the minimal you do to prevent the sort of resentment that results in actual radical action against the super wealthy. Mm-hmm. Just the whole worldview of these people really baffles me. I know in the piece I mentioned that Conard also makes this case for why his super wealth and others like him is not just the result of their merit and toil. It's the just outcome of the universe that, and there's no world in which they do not ever deserve what they have.
And of course, the flip side of that, if you carry it to its logical conclusion, is that those who don't have, that is also, that's the outcome of a just world, that they don't deserve any better than they got. Right.
Which is why I find the whole thing horrifying, because the logical endpoint of that worldview is that if you're poor, if you're working class, if you are someone who is skilled and talented but decided to be an artist, and so you don't have a ton of money, you're not. It's not just that like you are where you are by your effort. You deserve it. You are sort of morally suspect. To me, it's like only a short step from this worldview to kind of like extolling the hereditary virtues of rich people, right? That like by virtue of how we were born, we deserve to have our position in society.
I'm really glad you pointed that out. I'm glad you collated the articles you did. It's a great blog piece, and I'm happy to feature it. Jamelle, I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right, Jamelle Bouie, you'll find that piece in the American Prospect, linked from our website at indeepradio.com. May 1st, very big for Occupy. I'm Angie Coiro. This is In Deep Radio, and we're spending this hour looking at the successes, some of the blemishes, and the ultimate outcome for Occupy on May Day. It was interesting to see that Barack Obama declared May 1st Loyalty Day in the midst of all the Occupy going on. Despite that, it did seem to get a decent amount of media attention. Some of it, unfortunately, focused on the violence in Seattle, broken windows, damaged property in San Francisco and in Oakland. We're going to take a look this hour at whether violence is disproportionately affecting the picture of the media, or the picture of Occupy presented by the media. We're talking to some media and to some occupiers to give a nice level picture of that. Chris Hedges is on the record. Commentator and author Chris Hedges has put himself on record about violence in Occupy.
The power we have is our powerlessness, our transparency, and our honesty. If we can find the self-discipline, the moral courage, and the strength to hold fast to these values, and that will require confronting and expelling those within the movement who refuse to accept those values, then I think we can bring them down.
Chris Hedges, an American journalist and author, talking to the issue of violence in Occupy. Turning now to one of the friends of the show, Joshua Holland is joining us. You know him as the host of Alternet Radio. He's also editor and senior writer at alternet.org and the author of The 15 Biggest Lies About the Economy. Josh, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Angie.
You and I had an interesting conversation offline, and I'll bring some of that public here. And I had mentioned that I thought Occupy wasn't going enough on the record to decry the violence in their midst, that the Black Bloc and some other groups that seem to be bent on violence weren't being called out, not with the kind of disowning where you'd like to see. These people do not speak for us. And you had the interesting response that, yeah, to your knowledge, that's a very important dialogue within Occupy. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy on the outside to think this isn't an issue that's getting a lot of airing within the Occupy movement. But, I mean, I've been covering Occupy Oakland, which is arguably the most militant Occupy, and also where there's been no small amount of vandalism and property destruction. And I've seen this occupation really wrestle with this issue internally. They've had a number of highly contentious general assemblies where they discussed this front and center. They entertained resolutions to stop this so-called diversity of tactics, the tacit approval of property damage and other things. They've had morning meetings about this, the camp meetings about this. There's been dozens and dozens and dozens of blog posts written about it. I think it's an issue that actually is front and center within the Occupy movement. However, we may not be happy with the way that conversation is going, because the conclusion is that they cannot come to a conclusion. So one of the fundamental parts of what makes this Occupy movement what it is this so-called, horizontal leaderlessness. At the end of the day, they really struggle with the question of who gets to speak, who gets to set the standards by which Occupy will comport itself. And this obviously varies from occupation to occupation. There's a few things that I think are important to note, though, which is that there have been some big protests where things have gotten bad. And it's not clear to me in every circumstance that the people who are perpetrating the vandalism or property damage are necessarily regulars within the Occupy movement. These are fora, these big demonstrations, they're opportunities for people who want to confront police to come out and confront police. Mm-hmm. And, I've seen this many, many times where somebody does that, where somebody throws something at police or whatever, and I'm with many people who are camping out in the occupation, and they say, we don't really know that person. Where is that person from? In San Francisco, the night before May 1st, for example, there was property damage that followed this kind of big Occupy party. I spoke to 4 members of Occupy San Francisco the following day on the 1st, and all 4 of them told me the same thing, that, it's a very small community, and that the guys who had done this, who had kind of gone on this rampage and broken the windows of cafes and other mom and pop businesses, were people that they had never seen before. They were completely unrecognizable to them. So it's very important for us to understand that this is a very diverse movement, and it's hard to say what is and isn't Occupy.
That's a really good point you're bringing up. By the way, I want to clarify for our audience, and I'm talking to Josh as someone who has done a great job journalistically covering Occupy. I'm not talking to him as a member of the Occupy movement. Fortunately, he's privy to a lot of the meetings and the other work through their other inside information through his work as a journalist. In the next segment, we're going to be talking to a member of Occupy Cleveland. Of course, the big story there this week was that the FBI said that a handful of members of Occupy, as they were first identified, were conspiring to blow up a bridge. And as that story has evolved, Josh, and this is where it turns really interesting, not only is there the phenomenon that you described, whereas at least 3 of these people were at the very fringes of the movement, if involved in the movement at all, but that it looks as though there was some, if you want to apply the word, coercion going on. People who tried to back out of the plan told, look, you're doing this for your family. Look how far into this you are. You don't want to back out now. And this throws us back into the days of the Vietnam War protests, where it served the administrations to manipulate the protesters to create a certain image of what they were doing and to destroy the image of the good they were doing.
Well, that's right. And it also is part and parcel with counterterrorism in the United States in the last 10 years. We've seen very many plots where it's a hapless lunatic, a hapless moron who really doesn't have the operational capacity to mount a terrorist attack. But the FBI comes along and helpfully provides them the means to supposed means to carry out an attack. In this case, like many cases, the explosives that they were given were not real explosives. Mm-hmm. So this is the way we're seeing a lot of counterterrorism cases. These people may be extremists, they may have an extreme ideology, but the operationalization of that is done by the government. We've seen this in case after case after case.
One of the things that I worry about for Occupy is that because they are horizontal and leaderless, they don't have someone speaking up, making final decisions, someone to guide the media message, that trying to control the dialogue, which is so important these days, is sometimes too big a task for them. And let me throw an example at you. In San Francisco, there were all the broken windows from damage in the Mission area, and there was a list of 8 or 9 businesses that were damaged there. I happened to see through Twitter that members of Occupy San Francisco were starting to collect money to pay back some of the damage for these windows as a sign of support for local business people. Wells Fargo, with their PR machine intact, jumped in with a $25,000 grant. They didn't have to collect. They just had to write the check and immediately put out the PR that we're doing this. We're part of the neighborhood. These are our business fellows, and we're going to pay for this damage. We're going to help them out here. That illustrates so many of the strikes that are against Occupy, both because of their structure, their size, and the fact that they're new, Wells Fargo ain't.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that the Occupy movement as a whole has done some very intelligent messaging. I mean, the whole 99% to 1% is a really brilliant way of summing up many decades of growing inequality dynamics in our political economy that go back quite a ways. But at the same time, there has been some incredibly brain-dead messaging. Just really, really, things that if they were a more top-down organization, if they were like the Tea Parties where they have, basically organizational infrastructure to fall back on, they would be much more savvy. I kind of see this as both it's Occupy's big fault and also as an advantage. I mean, it doesn't have a leader that can be crucified in the way that, say, Van Jones has been by the conservative media, just as an example. So, it goes both ways. I think that it also is part of what makes Occupy so interesting and attractive to people. They are truly showing by example a different social model. And that's not easy to do, and it comes with a lot of faults, a lot of hazards, as those that we're discussing now. But I think it's also a strength.
I've already recorded the conversation that we're going to be hearing in a few moments with Johnny, who's at the Occupy Cleveland camp. One of the things he said that struck me was that he felt that with the coverage of the FBI story there, he really personally felt that they were getting a fair shake from the mainstream media. I'm thinking back to the Bush years where we could put hundreds of thousands of people on streets arguing against the war, not just in the U.S., but all throughout the major countries of the world, anti-war marches. And we couldn't get covered to save our soul. And, you put 3 or 4 more radical right-wing people with really provocative signs, and they make the evening news. Is there something of a turnaround coming here where we couldn't even get on the news with our protest marches, and here's Occupy not only getting covered, but, as they say, getting a fair shake?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see. There's been some remarkably bad coverage, of course, of Occupy and lazy coverage, but there's also some fairly fair-minded coverage. I thought that the local media did a fairly good job covering the mission vandalism, and they didn't just assume that they were occupiers. Even the mainstream media said, "Well, it's unclear who this group was." It's maybe it's just that they caught fire at the right moment. I mean, Occupy emerged after the Tea Party fervor had fallen to the wayside and during the worst financial crisis in 70 years. And that may be, that may account for why they are getting coverage in the way that those anti-Iraq war protests didn't. It's also the case that I think there's an increasing understanding within the media that inequality is a real story. The growing inequality, 30 years of growing inequality, is a story that's worth telling. During the early parts of the Iraq War, it was almost heretical to question the wisdom of that invasion. Right,
it was unpatriotic, as I recall at the time.
That's right.
Josh, you're no slouch yourself getting the coverage out there on Occupy, and I thank you for that and for your time.
Thanks for having me, Angie.
Joshua Holland, you can hear him on Alternet Radio. We'll put a link to that on our website at indeepradio.com. Up next here on In Deep Radio, we're going to the Occupy Cleveland camp, and we're going to talk to Johnny on the spot in Cleveland for In Deep Radio. I'm Angie Coiro. This is In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. We're spending this hour on Occupy, the president's well-known on May Day, mostly in a positive sense, in some negative senses as well, with the destruction here in the Bay Area happened in San Francisco and in Oakland. Disproportionate focus on some of the violence, according to some. One of the things that really grabbed headlines, though, came out of Cleveland. Occupy Cleveland had some members that were apparently solicited by the FBI, taped, and eventually busted for planning to blow up a bridge. And the stories that have come out of that have some eerie echoes of COINTELPRO back from the Vietnam days. I don't have too much time to go into that. Let me give you the thumbnail sketch. That is what was later found to be illegal activity on the part of the government, manipulating protesting groups in essence, making them look worse than they were by focusing on the few and by encouraging illegal activities. I do want to issue a couple disclaimers before we have this coming conversation. One is, it is not entirely clear what happened in the full interactions between the FBI and these ostensible members of Occupy Cleveland. There are facts that are yet to come. The second thing that I have to clarify is that my guest, who is going by the name of Johnny, is a part of Occupy Cleveland. He's been in the tent there in Cleveland since October. And because of the nature of his membership in Occupy, he's not speaking as an individual with his full name and his full qualifications out there. And I am presenting this to you as a conversation with a man who's going to tell us what he knows, and whether you find him to be believable, whether you find his facts to be something you can accept as he is presenting them, I'm going to leave that up to you as a listener, as I'm leaving it up to myself as a host. So with all of that, I want to head on over to the tent in Cleveland and say, Johnny, thank you for joining us and thank you for taking time.
Okay, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Let me ask you about what you've seen in the media representation of what went down with the FBI busts for Occupy Cleveland. Do you feel that for the most part, between a combination of the mainstream media and the alternative media, do you feel like the story has been put out there accurately and fully?
Well, on a local level, I'd have to say the mainstream media has been pretty fair about it. There's been a few pieces where they've put in people saying some pretty rotten things, and they want bad things to happen to them while they're in prison. But for the most part, I mean, it's been covered pretty fairly by the mainstream. The alternative, of course, the right wing bloggers and whatnot have been ripping us apart. But I don't have any complaints about how it's been covered. It's been covered fairly, I'd say, locally anyway. I heard there's a place out in Tampa, Florida, I believe it is, where they weren't very nice about it. They were saying it was an Occupy Cleveland thing, which is just not true.
Well, that's part of the issue is that, and we've had this here in the San Francisco Bay Area where there are groups that attach themselves to Occupy, and it's really in the eye of the beholder whether they're Occupy members. I mean, out here we have the Black Bloc, and they're responsible for a lot of the destruction. They stay together as a group within Occupy, so I mean, even visually they're separate. They're with their own group, with their own agenda, with their own routes. Tell me about the relationship of these accused bomb plotters and Occupy Cleveland. What's the connection there?
There's three of them that were a part of Occupy Cleveland, and to tell you the truth, they were nobody really seen them to be capable of something like this. They were active in Occupy Cleveland. One of them was doing a lot of canvassing and outreaching. They had lots of good ideas about upcoming things we can do to like help raise money and things like that. So it was really confusing to see it. They were pretty good with Occupy. It would have been nice if they would have distanced themselves from Occupy a bit with this event, but unfortunately that didn't happen. But they were only two of them were really very, very active in Occupy. Mm-hmm. No violence. No, there was nothing like that with their activity with Occupy. But, yeah, the other three, I don't know. The other three were just, they were out looking for trouble. Maybe not. I don't know. I don't know them too well.
Now, you and I, when we talked yesterday, you said that to your understanding, there was an element of coercion, that two of these guys tried to back out of this alleged plot, and it was the FBI that said, hey, look, you're committed to this. You need to go through with this now.
Well, yeah, they were. Even when you read the affidavit, you can see like all these different elements of the doubt they had with it, and them wanting to back out, and that, it wasn't necessarily. It was the informant that the FBI was using. He was, making just little subtle threats, like, oh, you can't back out now, and this guy's getting them bombs and stuff, so you got to think this guy's got a lot of connections, so he could probably really hurt us if he wanted to. So, I mean, a couple of impressionable, young, vulnerable kids, I mean, it was the informant really was the one, so the FBI allowed it to happen, of course, and they were pushing it to happen, and they were obviously recruited for this, keep in mind. It wasn't their idea to do this. This whole bridge thing was an FBI, it was a sting they set up. So they came to them with this idea and recruited them for this. at a very vulnerable time for them and for Occupy Cleveland. So, yeah, it was total misconduct by the FBI when you really look at it and study it, and just to see, like, you know, how it all went down. It was very, very distorted, very wrong what the FBI did.
Is anyone who's been covering this story or within the Occupy movement, has the word entrapment been used? Because I know that there's some very tentative legal ground that they might be on. Is there any talk about maybe, you know, going after the FBI for what was done here, if in fact they did entrap these guys?
Oh, most definitely. Yes, entrapment's been thrown around a lot. Of course, when you look at it, it's an obvious entrapment because the talking them into doing it even after their doubts. You know, they didn't, like, you would think that the FBI would say, oh, you want to back out? Cool, you know, they're not going to do it. But they wanted them to go through with it. You can read it through the affidavit and all the testimonies, not legal testimonies, things people were saying about what they knew about it. Because people knew something, you know, there were rumors floating around that this might happen, but there weren't any details to go on. We were just sort of, you know, looked at it as a rumor. But just to, you know, really read it. I mean, read the affidavit, and I mean, it's so they recruited these kids to do this, and that's just a shame. And they wanted to back out, and they kept telling them, no, you got to do it. You got to keep going. We got to go through with this.
I'll tell you what, Johnny, we're going to take a break right here, and we're going to come back and bring people up to date as to what's happening for Occupy Cleveland out there this week. So you're listening to Johnny, who's online from Cleveland Occupy, and I'm Angie Coiro. This is In Deep. In Deep Radio is a production of TalkBack Media. We are supported in part by our listeners. TalkBack Media produces discussions on key political, social, and cultural issues available for live digital audio and video venues. Learn more online at indeepradio.com. And if you are in a position to help us keep on the air, click one of the PayPal links on the side of the page. One-time gifts or a small monthly donation, whatever works for you. We appreciate it. Thanks. This is In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. I'm talking to Johnny, who's with Occupy Cleveland, and I wouldn't want to issue the same disclaimer because, you know, Johnny is a member of Occupy, and they do tend to, there is no leader to the group. He is not speaking for all of Occupy in Cleveland, and I'm not cross-checking the story that he's telling us from the scene. He is someone who's giving us his impressions from the scene, and it's up to you, you know, how well you take his story and what you think of it. That's up to you as a listener. Johnny, I want to remind our listeners, too, that they're hearing us on a delay. You and I are talking on Thursday, and in most parts of the country, this is going to be heard over the weekend. But today, Thursday morning, it looks like city workers pulled down your tent, and your tent has been out there for Occupy since October. Is that right?
Yeah, October. As soon as they tore down the little tent city we had, we established that canopy, you know, a big, you know, it was a canopy. We established that on the street public square, and we've had that since, you know, I'm not too clear on the exact date, but it was a couple days after they tore down or actually the next day they tore down the tent city. We had the canopy up, so it's been up there since early November. Or late October. Late October.
And there's the city is citing the fact that there's a group permit that didn't get renewed. And this is reflective of what we're seeing in protest sites across the country. This is a protest. This is an act of public revolt, and yet there's a permit process. You know, you go to City Hall and you get there's just something ironic about, you know, doing all this by the books when in fact there's something of a revolution going on. But the city says that the decision to revoke this permit had nothing to do with the FBI alleged bomb plot. Is that something that everybody there is accepting? Do they think that this is being done strictly on the merits of bookkeeping and a city's decision?
Well, from what people were saying and from me, no. They said that they were going to tear it down and once it got warm, and the casinos it's coming up May 15th, I believe. Sometime after May 15th, they're going to open the casino. So, I mean, that's the idea, that they were tearing it down for the casino. But to say that bridge thing had nothing to do with it, I mean, that's just, like, to me, an obvious lie. Of course that had something to do with it. But the main reason, in my opinion, was the casino. That's the biggest reason.
How much do people who aren't with Occupy engage you as they go by? Do they have conversations? Do you feel like you're getting some message out there?
You know what? I mean, there were, the next day, there were people in business suits and briefcases and all kinds of people coming up and giving us more support. I mean, our donations were running real thin leading up to that. We had $89 in donations the next day that came down to the 10th, and people just, like, all kinds of people, like more people than we've ever had coming down showing us support, like saying, we know you had nothing to do with that, and they know the city's screwing with us, and it's all a big game to them. So,
wow.
I mean, we've gotten a lot of support from a lot of people. It was really unexpected, to tell you the truth, but I'm glad to see it,
What about the makeup of your camp? How big is it, and what kind of people are represented there?
Well, we have a very big collective. A lot of people who have a lot of things like kids, jobs, things they got to take care of. So they come down when they can. They help with different working groups and things like that. But on site, we probably got a good core group of about 20, 30 people who really help, push our message out and help with the actions and the different things we do to help push along the movement. So. Very, very collective, I'd say.
I'm talking to Johnny, who's with Occupy Cleveland. Have you had the issues that we've seen here in the San Francisco Bay Area of, any contingents that are a little more focused on violence, any contingents that are more anarchic than the others? What kind of discussions do you have within the group about that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, we do have, like, there's one, I'm not going to say his name, but there's one, who calls himself an anarchist, but he's like strictly like anti-violent, and he gets very emotional when he sees violence. I mean, violence was never an issue. It was never talked about. I mean, we're strictly non-violent. It's in our good neighbor policy. I mean, that's just our strict rule, our strict, one rule we live by is non-violence. So I mean, violence is just out of the question. So that's really all I have to say about the violence, because it's, we're not violent. We never push or talk about or preach violence.
It's interesting that you were referring to a member there who's an anarchist, but he's a non-violent anarchist, because out here the black bloc is the violence and the anarchy kind of go together. Yeah,
well, the general conception of anarchy, in my opinion, anarchy, if you call yourself an anarchist, you're not. Anarchy is like a perfect world of utopia where everybody does I contribute my individual or whatever I have to contribute to society or the community, and they work in unison without any kind of leadership or anything like that. I mean, that's really the political ideology of anarchy. But we have a few people who would call themselves anarchists, but no violence or anything like that. They just look at the utopia of what it would be for each individual to do their part in society, so we don't need a government or need leadership or things like that. But that's like a perfect world that won't exist, in my opinion. So.
Let me ask you about your own convictions, and tell me, when you went out there in October, what you hope to accomplish and how your goals may have changed or shifted over time as to what you think you can accomplish now.
Well, I mean, since I remember I seen something about John Lennon when I was 15, and that inspired me to be, I always want to be like an activist. So once, the years went by, Cleveland's very inactive. It's not very big in activity with activism. Once I seen Occupy Wall Street, I was trying to figure out, how am I going to get to Wall Street? I got to get down there. I got to, I hope that it would grow, because I've seen it growing day by day. More and more people, 20,000, 30,000, and all these different cities start popping up. So I thought, this is really going. So this is something that might work. So I thought, this is worth my time to go down there and hopefully put enough political pressure on city governments and the federal governments to really make the change that most people, all people, want to really see. Nobody wants deregulated big corporations and banks just taking over cities and foreclosing homes. It's nothing. Nobody wants to see that. So, I mean, I really believe. I still believe in Occupy. I still believe it has the power to change not only this country, but all the countries that are occupying. Greece, all these different places where these things are happening. I think eventually it'll turn from Occupy to people rising up against oppression, because that's really what it's about, just all-around oppression. So I really hope to see. I came down here to help, facilitate that change, and I'm still going to be down here. I'm still going to be occupying. So I believe in its message. I believe in it. I believe it'll succeed.
When you look around you, I know Cleveland has really had a hell of a time with this economy. Do you see the homeowners who are underwater, the people who are out of work, the people who are running out of unemployment? Do they understand that Occupy is about them?
There's still a lot of people who don't, but there's a lot of people who do. There's, it's hard to say, because when you get a bunch of young kids running around, protesting and things like that, it just looks like it's just a bunch of troublemakers. So there's still a lot of the working class who are still divided. They believe in the message, but they're not sure that anything's really going to come of it or anything's happening. But my dad's a steel worker, and they're trying to take his pension away, and he's not really too pivy on the whole. He's not real political. Mm-hmm. So that's it's hard to gauge from that. But we have a lot of city workers, RTA drivers who stop by the tent, and we give them coffee and food, and they support us. So there's a big older collective in the working class who does support.
Johnny, I thank you so much for your time, and I thank you for everything you're doing. Best of luck to you.
Okay.
Johnny is at Occupy Cleveland. You can find this interview and more information and links at indeepradio.com. I'm Angie Coiro. This is In Deep, staying with our topic of Occupy for this hour and expanding a little bit beyond that in the next hour. I have a very interesting guest for the whole hour, and his name is Lawrence Shoup. He's a retired academician. He's an historian, and his book, Rulers and Rebels, is a people's history of early California, 1769 to 1901. Sounds a bit off topic for Occupy. It is not. He's got some very interesting parallels to draw there. Right now we're talking about the future of Occupy. What is next for them? And Josh Harkinson of Mother Jones Magazine provoked a couple, shall we say, energetic responses with his idea that it's time for Occupy to move on to running people for office. His article is titled, Why Occupy Should Be the Left's Tea Party, with the note that May Day was a success, but Occupy needs to rethink itself if it wants to change America. Josh Harkinson, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Angie.
So you've been following Occupy for Mother Jones Magazine. You've been essentially their Occupy guy. And you make a point of saying that until this point you hadn't chosen to take the pundit role. You've done some pretty straight reporting. What moved you to switch hats? What moved you to start putting out your opinion of what needs to be done here?
Well, I feel like the movement has been successful, remarkably successful overall since it began in September. And at the same time, I see that its momentum is fading. There was a poll that came out last month in which a majority of respondents felt like Occupy had run its course, and they actually believed that the Tea Party was more relevant. And that was a major poll done by NBC. And so I think the American public is starting to have doubts that Occupy is relevant. But beyond that, I just don't know if it's really continuing to achieve a lot. I mean, it's really hard to point towards concrete policy accomplishments. I think it changed the subject to income inequality, to issues like corporate control of politics, and away from this sort of Tea Party-dominated discussion about federal debt. But even that conversation has begun to fade, I think, as people have gotten kind of tired of seeing the same thing over and over again. You can only see so many protests before you stop paying attention. And I don't think the protests are drawing more people than they did in the fall. I mean, May Day was great and it was big, but it's going to be hard for Occupy to sustain that kind of momentum. So I just believe, after talking to a lot of protesters as well as historians of social movements, et cetera, that the movement could accomplish a lot more if it expanded its focus, not shifted it, but expanded it to include electoral politics.
It's interesting, and I'm actually very grateful that you placed this in a historical context, because one of our weaknesses as a country is we try to do everything fresh as though it's for the first time, and there is precedent for a lot of this. One of the things that you noted in your article, Occupy's much hyped Phase 2, the American Spring, suggests an endgame that's virtually impossible in today's America, the toppling of a corrupt political system under the sheer weight of its own repression, unlike in Egypt or Tunisia. The only real revolutions in our comparatively affluent nation have ultimately been won or lost at the ballot box. So what I hear you saying there, and by putting it into the context of the revolutions that have happened here, is that Occupy in its current status is going to continue to fade. My question to you would be, if it does choose to expand, doesn't that challenge the very nature of what Occupy is? It is by nature non-hierarchical. It's by nature, run as the ultimate democracy, everything being voted on, nobody standing up to be the leader. So can something that is set up with that kind of body suddenly become a power at the ballot box?
Well, I think it can. It's not going to be easy, but I mean, Occupy, by nature of being decentralized, is something that anybody can associate themselves with, at least theoretically. I mean, some component of an Occupy group in any city could tomorrow go out and say, hey, we're going to campaign for this person because we really agree with what they're saying. And, the only impediment to that happening is there are a few. I mean, one is that people need to decide they want to do that, but the other is that people who also consider themselves part of Occupy need to be okay with it, because if they're just going to criticize people who try to do that, then it's going to pull the rug out from under those efforts. And so I'm not saying that everybody in Occupy needs to go out and start hitting the campaign trail, but I think if and when people decide they want to do that, I would be disappointed if the kind of more anarchist, radical faction of Occupy starts poo-pooing that idea, because I think that would be really counterproductive.
What kind of reactions have you received from the Mother Jones readership on this article?
It's been mixed. I mean, I would say about 50% of the comments I've gotten on Twitter have been positive and 50% have been negative. And the sort of intensity of that opinion also varies. But I think people are generally willing to discuss the idea, and it certainly would be a major shift from how Occupy has conceived of itself previously. So I'm not surprised that the reaction has been mixed. But I just felt like it was an important time to raise the idea, because I think Occupy is trying to kind of figure out what Phase 2 is going to look like, and that debate I think needs to be a robust one. And so that's why, I'm trying to kind of just spur dialogue here.
Josh Harkinson's article on Mother Jones Magazine, Why Occupy Should Be the Left's Tea Party, is linked from our website at indeepradio.com. Josh, running for office means money, and money means in some cases co-opting, in some cases corrupting it. And with Citizens United, being the law of the day, it takes a great deal of money to run for office. Do you have any inclination as to how Occupy can be competitive in a Citizens United world?
Well, certainly it would be difficult. But, I think what needs to happen in order to overcome that hurdle is just a truly mass movement of people who go out there and kind of call BS on politics as usual. And that's why I think Occupy can really lend some credibility and expertise. Certainly by boycotting the political system for the last 8 months, they've made a point, which is that the whole thing is rigged. And I think that they need to take that message and kind of apply it on the campaign trail one way or another. They don't have to necessarily campaign for mainstream Democratic politicians, but if they went out and supported, whoever they think is a worthy candidate, and just constantly pounded that message that, hey, here's somebody who, isn't completely corrupted. Here's somebody who really represents the 99%. Then I think that would give them a boost potentially. And so it's still possible for the message to kind of break through the corporate-funded media landscape if that message really rings legitimate and true for people. And so it's that kind of legitimacy, that credibility, that integrity that Occupy still has that I think could be applied to politics in a strategic and effective way.
Well, now you've been covering Occupy Wall Street for Mother Jones since last fall. And in terms of their ability to message and in terms of their becoming more sophisticated about the media world we're dealing with today, what kind of growth have you seen around that? What kind of evolution?
Well, in the early days, it was Occupy seemed like it could grow in any number of different directions. People would go to these meetings, these General Assembly meetings and working group meetings, and some of them wanted to come out with concrete demands and get engaged in politics, and others, didn't want to do that. And I think over time, these meetings were really long and tedious, and the people who kind of had the energy to stick it out through them were kind of the more radical anarchist type, original, Occupy campers. And I think that their perspective is that engaging with the political system in any way is sort of a legitimization of that system. And so I think that as time has gone on, Occupy has, I think it's become more sophisticated in the sense of realizing that it needs to partner with outside groups like labor unions, for example, but its focus has remained around issues that kind of the radicals can also endorse, which mainly means challenging corporations directly. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's what I would say.
I'm talking to Josh Harkinson of Mother Jones magazine. When you look at what became of the Tea Party is a fascinating story. And I think people forget that in the beginning, they were more than anything else against corruption by money. And I'll appreciate your correcting me if that's not your recollection of this. But it gradually became a project of the far right, and then Dick Armey's money got involved and other things. Essentially, they were co-opted by the far right. I saw a very touching website article, which I hope I can dig up for our own website, from a Tea Party person, one of the original Tea Partiers, who watched what happened as the religious rightists and the racists and the others moved in and took that party over. I know that in Occupy, there are people who are suspicious of the same kind of thing happening. When 99% Spring came around, they looked at the parties involved, including the Democratic Party, and some in Occupy said, no way, you're not co-opting our movement. We formed this. It's not yours. So I'm looking at your idea of them getting to where they can field candidates. How can they gird themselves to take part in a movement where money and people may well be trying to influence them and may well divide them?
Well, it's a tough question, and I certainly think that the concerns about being co-opted are valid on some level. And it's definitely the case that the Tea Party was co-opted by the Koch brothers and others. I think what you need to do is really be careful about who you support, and make sure that the principles that they espouse meet some basic standards. Maybe there's kind of specific positions on taxes or campaign finance reform that would be kind of a hurdle that any candidate would need to cross before getting any kind of Occupy support. But it's hard to prevent co-optation when you have such a decentralized movement, because there's no leader who can just say, oh, well, you can't use our name, you can't use our brand. It really kind of has to be more of a consensus of all the people who are involved. And it's going to be hard to get that. So I think that's the challenge. But, I think if Occupy, I think Occupy is coming at it from a much smarter position to begin with. I mean, the Tea Party, I think by nature of being on the right, was always more pro-corporate to begin with, and always just less skeptical of the Koch brothers of the world. And so I just feel like the kind of DNA of the Occupy movement is going to prevent it from being co-opted anywhere to the level that, the Tea Party was.
Since you've been covering the Occupy movement for long enough, I'd like to ask you, aside from the issue of what they should do next, just how you feel they've fulfilled their mission of trying to reach out beyond what people might easily dismiss as, troublemakers, radicals, old hippies, whatever. I remember from early on in the Occupy movement, there were very powerful images in the news, a grandmother, a person in a business suit. I mean, things that really challenged our idea of who Occupy was and who it is who's willing to get out there on the street and fight against the government and against corruption of power. Have they taken full advantage of that as a movement? Has Occupy really managed to penetrate society with the idea that we are you, we are everyone?
Well, I think they did for a while, during the fall. And I was down at Zuccotti Park, every day for months, and I saw a lot of people who had never really engaged in a political protest before of any sort. And the problem is that those people have stopped showing up. They still do. I guess that's slightly, I'll walk that back a little. May Day turned out a lot of people who aren't part of Occupy. But I think that kind of the core Occupy events, when they're not partnering with labor unions or immigrant rights groups, when they're just holding their own protests, I don't see new faces turning out to those very much. And so I think that that has been lost on some level, and there are a variety of reasons for that. I think some of it is a sort of people can't conceive of how protesting like that is going to change things because they haven't seen any sort of indications of that change yet, at least, not any high-profile ones. So I think, Occupy needs to start kind of winning some small or medium-sized battles, thus kind of establishing a momentum for itself that's going to be attractive to people. And, that's kind of where getting into politics a bit more might also help.
Let me ask you one last question about that, and that is with the introduction of the 99% spring that I brought up, with the involvement of more established, more experienced, but less linear forms of democracy being involved. Have you seen a change in Occupy?
I've only seen a change in the sense that there are a lot of people who don't like the 99% spring, who, within the Occupy movement have been criticizing it. I don't think that, I don't think it's changed. You have to sort of distinguish between Occupy and, kind of people who sympathize with its tactics like 99% spring. And certainly that's a change. Just the existence of that program, for that system is a change. And, I think time will tell whether, all of this can partner, whether it can be a partnership on all of this, if it's going to be effective.
Josh Harkinson, I thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Josh's article is online at Mother Jones Magazine. You can find that on our website at indeepradio.com. Links to his work there. Stick around for the next hour. We'll be talking to Lawrence Shoup, author of Rulers and Rebels, A People's History of Early California, and an active member of the Occupy Oakland movement. You can follow us on Twitter at In Deep Radio. We're on Facebook, In Deep with Angie Coiro. You can send feedback, suggestions, and money via our website, indeepradio.com. We'll be right back.
Yes, I know it's gonna get better, 'cause it almost always does. I can't say much about the who and how, but I believe it just because. Day by day our bonds unweave, mammon gloats as nature grieves. Oh, save us from these pious thieves. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better, but I know it's gonna get better. Well, I love the world we live in, 'cause I live in it with you.
Thanks for tuning in this week to In Deep with Angie Coiro, a production of TalkBack Studios. You can get more information about us at indeepradio.com. And while you're there, you can become a member and support our work. There's a link there to contact us, too, with any questions or feedback. We're developing a series on mental health issues in our country, especially in this economy, and we'd love to have you be part of that. Please send us your topic suggestions, your stories, and your questions through our website. Click the contact button at indeepradio.com. Join us again this time next week for 2 more hours of in-depth conversation. I'm Angie Coiro. We'll see you then. You're listening to WPWC 1480 AM, Dumfries, Virginia. We Act Radio, home of Washington's progressive working community.